Thank you for this opportunity to spend a few minutes speaking about the future of democracy in Europe. I'd like to start with a proposition that the defining feature of geopolitics in the 21st century will be the clash between liberal democracy on the one hand and authoritarian oligarchy on the other. This is a clash between two tectonic plates that is erupting in Eastern and Central Europe. In fact, in some ways, Ukraine is ground zero for this clash. And it's a clash that's taking place both along a geopolitical plane, but also politically, internally, within individual countries. So geopolitically, we see that this clash has resulted already in wars in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine in 2014, when liberal democratic reforms, and in Georgia, the prospect of NATO membership, in Ukraine, an association agreement with the EU, both were unacceptable red lines for the authoritarian oligarchic regime in the Kremlin that wanted to suborn both countries and keep them within its oligarchic sphere of privileged interests. And so geopolitically it intervened to prevent those reforms from taking root and to prevent these countries from proceeding with their integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions. But politically, this conflict is also playing out across the region. We have seen already how liberal democracies like Hungary have been corrupted and subverted by internal forces that have skewed towards oligarchy and authoritarianism. The pattern is a now familiar one. It is one where political forces come to power and establish a monopoly on executive branch functions, and then form an alliance with business elites who are given preferential treatment, either in terms of tax and customs treatment, in terms of quasi-monopolies in certain sectors of the economy, in terms of a preference in the doling out of government procurement contracts. And then these regime-friendly business elites are able to buy up independent media. They're able to finance politicians, to bankroll parties, and generally to do the political elites' bidding in the economic arena. The merger of political and economic resources in the hands of a narrow elite is the defining feature of authoritarian oligarchy. And it trends towards authoritarianism in many cases, precisely because it restricts competition in the political arena. But the thing is, authoritarian oligarchy can coexist to a certain degree, or at least we've seen it coexist, with nominally democratic institutions. Take the case of Putin's Russia, which has nominally independent political parties, a nominally independent judiciary, and pluralism of the media, at least on the surface. But when one looks a little bit deeper at the institutions of Putin's Russia, one sees that they are subordinated to the political elite in the Kremlin, and that opposition parties really are not true opposition parties. They are pocket parties of the Kremlin. Nominally independent courts, in fact, take their orders through telephone justice, where verdicts are handed down by phone from the political masters in power, and so on and so forth. And so the institutions of liberal democracy on paper are corrupted by this entrenchment of political and economic power, again, in the hands of a narrow elite. That is the definition of authoritarian oligarchy. At the same time, right now, we see in Belarus just the latest manifestation of what has been a series of popular movements revolting against authoritarian oligarchy. You had the Rose Revolution in Georgia. You had the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. You had the Velvet Revolution in Armenia in 2018. You had a widespread anti-corruption movement in Slovakia. And now you have this pro-democracy movement in Belarus. And the one thing that all of these movements have in common is a combined national and civic awakening that really places emphasis on the dignity of the individual, the rights of individual citizens to elect their own representatives to decide on the future of public policy and of their country's future orientation. And it is a movement that is fundamentally rooted against the growth of authoritarian oligarchy. And it is heartening to see these movements flowering all over Central and Eastern Europe. But at this crucial juncture that we are in the year 2020, we see that these movements are fragile, that often there is regress, that even after a democratic revolution, there are revanchist forces who remain present in individual countries, who seek to perpetuate their rents, their economic power, that seek to corrupt political forces to do their bidding. And we also see outside powers in the form of Putin's Russia, seeking through dark money and disinformation to support those forces of revanche so that these countries remain weak democracies that can be easily manipulated from the outside. It may well be that the Kremlin has come to the conclusion that its use of military force, which was so dominant in Georgia and Ukraine, has actually proven, while tactically successful, to have been a strategic failure. The Kremlin may slowly be waking up to this fact, that its violation of these countries' borders, that its military invasion has in fact resulted in an anti-colonial movement, a democratic sense of awakening in these countries. And so, instead, the Kremlin relies on disinformation and dark money to try to subvert these countries from within. So we are at a crucial crossroads, both in Eastern and Central Europe, but also around the world. And you see that even countries like the United States are not immune to some of these forces of oligarchization. We see how politicization of law enforcement, stacking of the judiciary with partisan cronies, labeling independent media as enemies of the people, have subverted the quality of democratic institutions, even in the United States. We will get through this. We will get past this. But in other countries, democratic institutions are more fragile. And now is the moment for renewed unity on the part of the United States and its European allies and partners to invest in pro-democracy movements, to stand with the people of Belarus, to stand with those reformers in individual countries who seek to create politically independent anti-corruption institutions, who want to establish a business climate that is conducive to foreign direct investment and prosperity, who want to push back on some of these entrenched political forces that seek to consolidate power and tilt the playing field against their opponents. And so I am hopeful, cautiously optimistic, that with a change of leadership in the United States, that Washington will once again be at the forefront, together with our European partners and allies, in pushing for reform, in standing with democratic movements, in really advancing the cause of liberal democracy in this global competition. Because the other forces on the other side are very active, and they are not letting up. And whether it's Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, through its corrupt influence and economic manipulation of trade and investment, we see that they are empowering the forces of authoritarian oligarchy. And if we don't push back, these forces are going to become more and more dominant. And again, the trend with oligarchization is one that skews towards authoritarianism over time. So it is incumbent on the transatlantic community to push back, to support reformers, and to really lead once again with values. And I hope that we reach that point sooner rather than later. Thank you.